The rain had started as a whisper against the classroom windows during Emily's last period, but by the time she locked the school doors behind her, it had grown into a steady drumbeat against the pavement. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, the thin wool offering little protection against the October chill that seemed to seep through everything in Millbrook. 27 years old, and her biggest decision of the week had been whether to assign To Kill a Mockingbird or The Great Gatsby for her sophomore English class. Emily Chen had built her life around predictability, the same route to school every morning, the same lunch at 12:15, the same bus home at 4:47. It was a small life, perhaps, but it was hers, and after the chaos of her childhood, the rhythm of routine felt like safety. The bus stop sat empty under the flickering streetlight, its metal bench glistening with rainwater. Emily checked her phone. 4:52. The bus had never been late before, not once in the 3 years since she'd moved to Millbrook. She dialed the transit authority, listening to the automated message that informed her Route 47 was experiencing delays due to weather conditions. By 5:30, the rain had soaked through her cardigan and was working on her blouse. The streetlight above her head buzzed and went out, leaving her in the growing darkness. She tried calling a taxi, the one company in town, but the line went straight to voicemail. The situation felt increasingly hopeless as she scrolled through her contacts. There wasn't anyone to call. The other teachers lived in the opposite direction, and she'd never been one for making friends easily. Her mother lived 2,000 miles away in California, still trying to convince Emily to move back home, to find a nice boy, to stop hiding in small towns where nothing ever happened. The headlights appeared first as twin points of light through the rain, growing larger as they approached. A black sedan pulled over to the curb, its engine purring quietly. The passenger window rolled down, revealing a man in his early 30s with dark hair dampened by the rain. He observed that she had been standing there for over an hour and wondered if everything was all right, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't place. Emily stepped closer to the car, close enough to see his face more clearly in the dashboard light. Strong jaw, eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, the kind of face that belonged in old movies. She explained that the bus had broken down and she was waiting for someone to pick her up. He pointed out that no one seemed to be coming in this weather, glancing at her phone which showed no missed calls. He mentioned that he was heading north and could drop her somewhere if she needed help. Everything Emily's mother had taught her about stranger danger screamed at her to decline politely and wait for another option. But another option wasn't coming, and the rain was getting heavier. There was something about his eyes. Tired, maybe, but kind. The car was expensive but not flashy. Clean, but lived in. A coffee cup sat in the holder, a paperback novel on the passenger seat. She told him she lived about 15 minutes north on Maple Street. He introduced himself as Michael, leaned across to open the door, and mentioned that he knew where that was. Emily slid into the passenger seat, immediately grateful for the warmth. The car smelled like leather and something else. Cologne, maybe, or aftershave. Michael moved the book to the back seat, and she caught a glimpse of the title. 100 Years of Solitude, in Spanish. She asked if he read Garcia Marquez in the original, and he seemed surprised that she recognized it. Emily explained that she taught English, though some days she felt more like a referee than a teacher. Michael smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him, and asked about her work with high school students. She described her sophomore and junior level students as being at that dangerous age where they think they know everything, but haven't yet learned how much they don't know. Michael agreed about it being a dangerous age, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. But he was focused on the road ahead, windshield wipers fighting against the rain. They drove in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the radio playing something soft and instrumental. Emily found herself relaxing for the first time all day. There was something calming about Michael's presence, the way he drove with easy confidence, never rushing despite the weather. When they reached Maple Street and she directed him to turn left, a strange grinding sound came from under the hood, followed by a series of metallic clicks. The engine coughed once and died. Michael coasted to the side of the road and turned the key. Nothing. He tried again, and the engine turned over but wouldn't catch. He apologized, running a hand through his hair, saying this had never happened before. Emily looked out at the rain, which seemed to be falling even harder now. She mentioned there was a garage about 2 miles back, but they would be closed until morning. Michael pulled out his phone, scrolled through his contacts, then closed it without making a call. He suggested the Millbrook Inn, a hotel just off the highway where they could call a mechanic and maybe get a tow in the morning. When Emily questioned his use of the word we, he explained that he couldn't leave her stranded after promising her a ride home. He assured her he would get her own room. He simply couldn't abandon her there in the storm. Emily studied his profile in the dim light from the dashboard. Everything about this situation should have terrified her, but instead, she felt oddly calm. Maybe it was the exhaustion from a long week of teaching, or maybe it was something about Michael himself, the way he had waited to make sure she was safe before suggesting the hotel, the book of poetry in Spanish, the careful distance he maintained even in the confined space of the car. She agreed to the hotel plan. As they gathered their things and stepped back into the rain, Emily caught Michael checking his rearview mirror, his eyes scanning the empty street behind them. When he noticed her watching, he smiled and offered her his jacket, claiming he was just checking for damage to the car. But Emily had the distinct feeling he had been looking for something else entirely. The Millbrook Inn had seen better decades. The carpet in the lobby showed paths worn by countless travelers, and the wallpaper had faded to the color of old tea. But it was warm and dry, and the elderly man behind the desk greeted them with the kind of genuine hospitality that had mostly disappeared from chain hotels. He commented on the rough night for driving while handing Michael 2 key cards for rooms 14 and 16 on the second floor, mentioning that continental breakfast started at 6 if they were early risers. Emily's room was small but clean, with a view of the parking lot and the highway beyond. She could see Michael's sedan under the security light, rain pooling on its hood. She changed into the spare clothes she always kept in her school bag, a habit learned from years of teenage mishaps involving food fights and science experiments gone wrong, and was debating whether to call her mother when someone knocked on her door. Michael stood in the hallway, hair still damp from the rain, holding 2 cups of coffee from the lobby. He offered it as a peace offering for dragging her into this mess. Emily protested that he hadn't dragged her anywhere. If anything, he had rescued her from drowning at that bus stop. She admitted that this was probably the most interesting thing that had happened to her in months. Michael observed that this was either very flattering or very concerning about her social life. Emily laughed, surprised by how easy it was to talk to him, and confirmed it was definitely concerning. She invited him in, adding that unless he thought it would be improper. Michael hesitated for just a moment, then stepped into the room. He moved carefully, Emily noticed, like someone who was always aware of his surroundings. When he sat in the room's single chair, he positioned himself so he could see both the door and the window. She asked what he did when he wasn't rescuing stranded teachers. Michael explained that he was in consulting, business consulting, mostly helping companies restructure when they were in trouble. Emily observed that it sounded like it involved a lot of traveling. He confirmed it was more than he would like, then turned the question back to her, asking if she had always wanted to be a teacher. Emily laughed and said, God, no. She had wanted to be a journalist, actually, investigate corruption, uncover scandals, change the world through the power of the written word. She gestured around the modest hotel room, noting that clearly that had worked out exactly as planned. Michael asked what had changed her mind, and Emily considered the question. Most people didn't ask about the gap between dreams and reality with such genuine interest. She explained that her father had died when she was 16. Drunk driver, not her father, but the other guy. Her mother had fallen apart, and Emily realized she needed stability more than adventure. Teaching had offered that. Steady paycheck, summers off to regroup, a chance to make a small difference instead of trying to save the entire world. Michael expressed his condolences, and she could hear the sincerity in his voice. Emily replied that it had been a long time ago, and that she did love teaching most days. She described the magic of watching a kid suddenly understand something they had been struggling with, like a light switching on. They talked for another hour, ranging from books to travel to the peculiar challenges of living in small towns. Michael was well-read and well-traveled, but there was something guarded about the way he spoke, as if he was carefully choosing which parts of himself to reveal. When Emily mentioned a restaurant in Boston she had loved during graduate school, she could have sworn she saw recognition flash across his face, but he said nothing. At 9:30, Michael's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, and Emily watched his entire demeanor change. The easy smile disappeared, replaced by something harder, more alert. His shoulders tensed, and when he looked up from the phone, she felt like she was looking at a different person entirely. Emily asked if everything was okay. Michael claimed it was just work, but he stood up quickly, suddenly eager to leave. He mentioned that he should let her get some rest, that there would be a long day tomorrow dealing with mechanics and all that. She called his name as he reached for the door handle, stopping him. Emily asked directly if he was in some kind of trouble. For a moment, she thought he might tell her the truth. His hand tightened on the door handle, and she could see the internal struggle playing out across his face. Then he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He assured her it was nothing he couldn't handle and wished her good night. After he left, Emily sat on the edge of the bed staring at the door. The Michael who had rescued her from the rain, who had talked about books and asked thoughtful questions about her life, had been real. She was certain of that. But so was the man who had just left her room, the one who moved like he was being hunted, who checked his phone like he was expecting bad news, who positioned himself to watch all the exits. She walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot. Michael was standing beside his car, phone pressed to his ear, pacing in the rain. Even from 2 floors up, she could see the tension in his posture. Whatever conversation he was having, it wasn't about business consulting or car repairs. Emily pulled the curtain closed and tried not to think about the way Michael had looked at the text message, like it contained news he had been dreading. She tried not to think about the scar on his wrist, or the Spanish poetry, or the fact that a man who claimed to be a business consultant moved like someone trained for violence. But sleep, when it finally came, was filled with dreams of rain and running footsteps echoing in empty hotel corridors. Emily woke to the sound of voices in the hallway, low and urgent. The red digits on the bedside clock read 2:47 a.m. She lay still, listening, but the voices had moved away or stopped entirely. The rain continued its relentless drumming against her window, and she told herself it had probably been other guests returning late from dinner or drinks. But something felt wrong. The hotel had been nearly empty when they checked in, and the voices she'd heard hadn't sounded like casual conversation between travelers. There had been an edge to them, a tension that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She slipped out of bed and padded to the door, pressing her ear against the cool wood. Silence. Emily turned the deadbolt as quietly as she could and cracked the door open, peering into the hallway. Empty, but she could see that the light under Michael's door, room 14, was still on. Something made her step into the hallway. Later, she would wonder what had possessed her to leave the safety of her room, why her teacher's instincts for trouble had overridden her common sense. She moved barefoot across the worn carpet, stopping outside Michael's door. The voices were back, muffled but distinct. Michael's voice, strained and careful, and another man's voice she didn't recognize. The stranger's tone carried an accent, Russian maybe, or Eastern European, and an unmistakable note of menace. Emily caught fragments of the conversation, something about a timeline, about patience running out, about consequences. Her hand was reaching for the door handle before she realized what she was doing. The door wasn't fully closed, she discovered. It had been left slightly ajar, whether by accident or design. Through the narrow gap, she could see into the room. Michael stood near the window, still fully dressed despite the late hour. His posture was different from the relaxed man who had discussed literature with her earlier. Now he held himself like a coiled spring, ready to move at any moment. The stranger was a heavy-set man with silver hair and a face that looked like it had seen considerable violence. He sat in the room's chair with the casual confidence of someone used to being feared. The silver-haired man was explaining that certain people were growing impatient with Michael's extended absence. There had been expectations, commitments made, and Michael's sudden disappearance from Miami had caused considerable inconvenience. The man's tone suggested that inconvenience was not something his employers tolerated well. Michael responded that he had needed time to think, that rushing into something this significant was asking for mistakes. The silver-haired man laughed, but there was no humor in it. He reminded Michael that thinking time was a luxury he had forfeited when he had taken their money and agreed to their terms. Emily found herself holding her breath, trying to piece together the implications of what she was hearing. Michael wasn't a business consultant. That much was clear. Whatever he was involved in, it was dangerous enough to bring armed men to small-town hotels in the middle of the night. Because the silver-haired man was armed, she could see the bulge of a shoulder holster beneath his jacket. The stranger stood up, moving closer to Michael. He explained that they had been very reasonable, very patient, but patience had limits. Michael had 48 hours to return to Miami and fulfill his obligations, or they would be forced to find alternative ways to motivate him. The man's smile as he said this made Emily's blood run cold. Michael asked what kind of alternatives they had in mind. The silver-haired man's response was delivered in the same conversational tone he might use to discuss the weather. He mentioned that they had located Michael's sister in Portland, noted that she had a lovely apartment and a predictable routine. Such a shame if something were to happen to her because of her brother's stubbornness. The change in Michael was immediate and frightening. The careful control he had maintained throughout the conversation cracked, and Emily saw fury flash across his features. He stepped toward the other man, hands clenched into fists, but stopped himself just short of violence. The silver-haired man seemed delighted by this reaction, clearly pleased that he had found the pressure point he needed. Michael said he understood the message. The stranger nodded approvingly and moved toward the door, advising Michael not to disappoint them again. He paused at the threshold, adding almost as an afterthought that his employers had noticed Michael hadn't been traveling alone. Such a pretty young teacher, he observed. It would be unfortunate if she became collateral damage because of poor choices. Emily's heart stopped. They knew about her. Somehow, these people had identified her, learned where she worked, probably discovered where she lived. The casual way the man had mentioned her made it clear that her life had just become a bargaining chip in whatever deadly game Michael was playing. She backed away from the door as quietly as she could, but her foot caught the edge of a loose carpet tile. The soft scraping sound might as well have been a gunshot in the silent hallway. The conversation in Michael's room stopped abruptly. Emily ran. She sprinted back to her room, closed the door as silently as possible, and threw the deadbolt. Her hands were shaking as she grabbed her phone, but who could she call? The local police. What would she tell them? That she had overheard what sounded like a criminal conversation but couldn't prove anything. Footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, stopping outside her door. Emily held her breath, willing herself to be invisible. The footsteps continued past her room, heading toward the stairs. Minutes passed before she heard the soft knock on her door. Michael's voice, barely above a whisper, asking if she was awake. Emily hesitated, then opened the door. Michael stood in the hallway, his face pale and drawn. He looked at her bare feet, her disheveled hair, the fear she knew must be written across her features. He asked how much she had heard. Emily considered lying, but the expression in his eyes told her there was no point. She admitted she had heard enough to know he wasn't a business consultant and that both their lives were now in danger. Michael closed his eyes and leaned against the doorframe. When he opened them again, Emily saw something she hadn't seen before: genuine fear. Not for himself, but for her. He explained that he had tried to keep her out of this, that the car breaking down had been genuine bad luck. But now that they knew about her, running wasn't an option anymore. If he disappeared, they would use her to get to him, and if she disappeared, they would track her down eventually. Emily asked the question she was afraid to voice. What exactly had he gotten her into? Michael's answer was simple and terrifying. He told her he was supposed to be dead, and some very dangerous people had just discovered he wasn't. The rest of the night passed in fragments of whispered conversation and tense silences. Michael had moved to Emily's room after the silver-haired man left, positioning himself where he could watch both the window and the door. He explained in careful, measured words that his real name was Michael Kozlov, that he had been a financial analyst for what he had believed was a legitimate investment firm in Miami. Only after 18 months of work had he discovered that the firm was a front for money laundering, that the complex financial instruments he had been creating were designed to clean millions of dollars from human trafficking and arms dealing. Emily listened in growing horror as he described his attempts to extract himself from the organization. The people he worked for didn't believe in resignation letters or 2 weeks' notice. When Michael had tried to leave, taking copies of financial records as insurance, they had made it clear that his continued existence was a liability they couldn't tolerate. The car accident that was supposed to have killed him had been expertly arranged, except Michael had suspected betrayal and switched cars with a colleague at the last moment. Thomas Brennan, a fellow analyst who had discovered Michael's plan to expose the organization, had died in the explosion meant for Michael. The guilt in Michael's voice when he spoke Thomas's name was palpable. He had been hiding for 8 months, moving from city to city, trying to stay ahead of the people hunting him while attempting to find someone in law enforcement he could trust with the evidence he carried. Emily asked why he hadn't gone to the FBI immediately. Michael's laugh was bitter. He explained that the organization had connections everywhere: police departments, federal agencies, district attorneys' offices. 3 people he had tried to approach had died in suspicious accidents within weeks of their meetings. Michael had learned to trust no one in authority, to assume that anyone in law enforcement might be compromised. The silver-haired man's visit had shattered Michael's hope that he could simply disappear. They had found him despite all his precautions, which meant they had resources and information he had underestimated. Worse, they now knew about Emily, which gave them leverage he couldn't ignore. As dawn approached, Emily made a decision that surprised them both. She told Michael she wasn't going home. Not to her apartment, not to her classroom, not to her predictable life. If these people knew who she was, her old life was over anyway. She could either spend the rest of her days looking over her shoulder, waiting for them to decide she was a threat, or she could help Michael finish what he had started. Michael protested that she had no idea what she was volunteering for, that these people killed witnesses without hesitation. Emily acknowledged the danger, but pointed out that she was already a target. At least if she stayed with him, she would know when trouble was coming. The hotel's breakfast area opened at 6, and they were the first guests to arrive. The elderly desk clerk, who introduced himself as Harold, served them coffee with the careful attention of someone who had spent decades reading the moods of travelers. He noticed their exhaustion, the way they both kept glancing toward the parking lot, and made gentle conversation about the weather and road conditions. Harold mentioned that he had been running the Millbrook Inn for 32 years, had seen all kinds of people pass through. Some were running toward something, others running away. He had learned not to ask too many questions, but also to recognize when folks might need more help than they were asking for. His offer was casual, but pointed. If they needed to use the phone, send messages, or required any assistance he wasn't supposed to provide, he would be happy to help. Michael and Emily exchanged glances. Harold's knowing look suggested he understood more about their situation than his simple manner indicated. Michael asked carefully if Harold had been in the military. The older man's smile confirmed it. 20 years in the Army, much of it in places that weren't supposed to exist on official maps. He had developed certain skills and maintained certain connections that proved useful in his retirement. By 8 o'clock, the breakfast area had filled with other guests. Emily noticed how Michael cataloged each new arrival, assessing threat levels and escape routes with unconscious efficiency. When a group of 3 men in expensive suits entered and took a table near the door, Michael's tension became palpable. The men ordered breakfast but spent more time watching the other guests than eating. Harold approached their table with more coffee, mentioning casually that the men in suits had checked in around 4 a.m., claiming their original hotel had been overbooked. They had paid cash and declined to provide identification, which was unusual but not unheard of. However, Harold had noticed they seemed very interested in the guest registry when they thought he wasn't looking. The situation crystallized when one of the suited men approached Michael directly. He introduced himself as Agent Martinez from the FBI, explaining that they had been tracking a fugitive who might be in the area. The man's credentials looked legitimate, but Michael had learned to distrust appearances. When Martinez asked to speak with him privately, Michael declined politely but firmly. Emily watched the interaction with growing alarm. Martinez's partners had positioned themselves to block the exits, and their casual postures couldn't disguise the fact that they were prepared for violence. Harold had disappeared into the kitchen, but Emily caught a glimpse of him through the service window, speaking urgently into a phone. Martinez pressed his request, suggesting that cooperation would be in everyone's best interest. His tone remained professional, but Emily heard the underlying threat. Michael responded that he would be happy to speak with federal agents at a proper FBI office, with proper documentation and witnesses present. The standoff stretched across several tense minutes. The situation shifted when Harold emerged from the kitchen with 2 additional men, not hotel staff, but individuals who moved with the same careful awareness as Michael. Harold introduced them as friends who happened to be staying at the hotel, former colleagues who had decided to join the breakfast conversation. The newcomers positioned themselves strategically, making it clear that Martinez and his team no longer held numerical advantage. Martinez assessed the change dynamics and made a calculated retreat. He handed Michael a business card suggesting they would be in touch soon and led his team out of the breakfast area. Through the window, Emily watched them drive away in a black SUV that had been parked across from Michael's sedan. Harold waited until the SUV disappeared before explaining the situation to Emily and Michael. The phone call he had made was to a network of veterans who had learned not to trust authority blindly. Martinez's credentials might have been real, but that didn't mean he represented Emily and Michael's best interests. Harold had contacts who could verify Martinez's identity and intentions, but that would take time. Michael asked about the men who had helped them. Harold explained that Frank and Eddie were retired special forces, currently working private security. They had been passing through Millbrook when Harold's call reached them. The network Harold described was informal but extensive. Former military and intelligence personnel who had learned to watch out for each other when official channels failed. Frank, a weathered man in his 50s with intelligent eyes, confirmed that Martinez's story didn't match FBI operational procedures. Real federal agents didn't travel in three-man teams to small towns based on vague tips, and they certainly didn't block exits during casual interviews. Whatever Martinez represented, it wasn't legitimate law enforcement. Eddie, younger but equally alert, suggested that Michael and Emily needed to leave immediately. The fact that Martinez had found them at the hotel meant their location was compromised. Staying would only endanger Harold and his establishment, but leaving randomly would just make them easier targets on the open road. Harold proposed an alternative. The network Frank had mentioned included people with safe houses, people who could provide temporary shelter while they figured out their next move. There was a woman named Sarah Chen, no relation to Emily, despite the shared surname, who ran a horse ranch about 200 miles north. She specialized in helping people disappear when they needed time to regroup. Michael hesitated, reluctant to involve more civilians in his problems, but Emily pointed out that they were past the point of protecting bystanders. These people were offering help freely, understanding the risks. Refusing their assistance out of misplaced nobility would just get everyone killed. The decision was made quickly. Frank and Eddie would provide escort for the first 100 miles, taking back roads to avoid obvious surveillance. Harold would delay any inquiries about their departure for as long as possible, claiming they had mentioned driving to the next town for car repairs. As they prepared to leave, Emily realized that her old life was truly over. She would never again walk into her classroom, never again grade papers at her kitchen table, never again ride the 4:47 bus home. The thought should have terrified her, but instead, she felt oddly liberated. For the first time in years, she was moving toward something unknown, rather than hiding from change. Michael seemed to sense her thoughts as they loaded their few belongings into Frank's truck. He apologized again for dragging her into his nightmare, but Emily cut him off. She had made her choice with full knowledge of the consequences. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The rain had finally stopped, but storm clouds gathered on the horizon as they drove north. Emily watched the Millbrook Inn disappear in the side mirror, carrying with it the last remnants of her predictable existence. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the growing certainty that Michael Kozlov was worth risking everything to protect. Sarah Chen's ranch stretched across rolling hills that seemed to go on forever, the kind of landscape that made a person feel both insignificant and infinite at the same time. The main house was a sprawling structure of weathered wood and stone, designed more for function than beauty, but there was something deeply appealing about its honest simplicity. Sarah herself was a woman in her early 40s with calloused hands and eyes that had seen enough trouble to recognize it instantly. She welcomed Michael and Emily without questions, though Emily caught her exchanging meaningful looks with Frank before he and Eddie departed for their return journey. Sarah's hospitality came with an understanding of boundaries. She provided food, shelter, and safety, but she didn't pry into the details of why they needed all three. For 3 days, Emily and Michael existed in a strange bubble of normalcy. They helped with ranch work, shared meals in Sarah's large kitchen, and gradually began to relax into something resembling ordinary life. Emily discovered she enjoyed the physical demands of ranch work, the way it tired her body while clearing her mind. Michael proved surprisingly adept with the horses, moving among them with the same careful awareness he brought to everything else. But the peace was temporary, and they all knew it. Sarah had contacts throughout the region, people who kept her informed about strangers asking questions or unusual activity that might threaten her guests. On their fourth morning at the ranch, she brought disturbing news with the breakfast coffee. A team of federal agents had been making inquiries in the nearest town, showing photographs and asking about two fugitives believed to be armed and dangerous. The photos were professional quality, recent surveillance shots that showed Emily and Michael clearly. Sarah's contact at the local diner reported that the agents seemed very interested in any reports of strangers, particularly those who might be staying at isolated properties. Michael's reaction to this news was immediate and decisive. They had to leave immediately before the search pattern reached the ranch. Sarah protested that her property was defensible, that she had preparations for exactly this kind of situation, but Michael refused to consider it. Too many people had already died because of him, and he wouldn't add Sarah's name to that list. Emily found herself caught between admiration for Michael's protective instincts and frustration with his tendency to make unilateral decisions. She pointed out that running blindly would only make them easier targets, that they needed a plan beyond simply staying ahead of pursuit. Michael acknowledged her point, but maintained that any plan requiring them to stay in one place was too dangerous for the people sheltering them. The argument was settled by Sarah herself, who revealed information that changed everything. She hadn't been entirely honest about her background when Harold's network had contacted her. While she did run a working ranch, her primary occupation was something quite different. Sarah was a former CIA operative who specialized in extracting assets from hostile situations. The ranch was one of several safe houses she maintained for people whose lives had been complicated by contact with intelligence agencies. More importantly, Sarah had contacts within the federal government who weren't compromised by whatever organization was hunting Michael. She had already reached out to a deputy director at the FBI who specialized in organized crime, a man named Robert Torres, whom she had worked with during her CIA years. Torres was reportedly clean, with a reputation for being incorruptible and a track record of successfully prosecuting complex financial crimes. Michael's response to this revelation was skeptical. He pointed out that he had already tried trusting federal agents, with uniformly fatal results for the agents involved. Sarah acknowledged his concerns, but emphasized that Torres was different. He operated with a small, carefully vetted team and had survived 30 years in federal law enforcement by never trusting anyone outside his inner circle. The discussion was interrupted by an urgent phone call. Sarah listened intently, asked several sharp questions, then ended the call with her face grim. The federal agents making inquiries had just expanded their search to include a detailed canvass of all properties within a 50-mile radius. More concerning, they had been joined by additional personnel who definitely weren't law enforcement, men in expensive suits driving vehicles with out-of-state plates. Emily felt the familiar chill of impending danger. The careful peace of the ranch was about to be shattered, and this time there would be nowhere to run. Sarah seemed to reach the same conclusion because her next words carried the weight of final decisions. She told Michael that his time for running was over. The people hunting him had resources and patience that exceeded his ability to stay hidden indefinitely. His only chance for survival was to trust someone with the power to strike back, and Torres represented the best option available. Sarah had already arranged a meeting for that evening at a location Torres controlled, with security measures that would protect all parties involved. Michael asked what guarantee they had that Torres wasn't compromised like the others. Sarah's answer was brutally honest. There were no guarantees in their situation, but continuing to run guaranteed eventual capture and death, while trusting Torres offered at least the possibility of ending the hunt permanently. Emily found herself making another life-changing decision without adequate time to consider the consequences. She supported Sarah's proposal, arguing that Michael's evidence was meaningless unless someone with authority was willing to act on it. They had reached the point where calculated risks were preferable to certain doom. The afternoon was spent in preparation that felt disturbingly like preparing for war. Sarah retrieved weapons and equipment from hidden locations around the ranch, including communication devices that looked far more sophisticated than anything a retired horse rancher should possess. She explained escape routes, contingency plans, and emergency procedures with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. Michael used the time to organize his evidence, creating multiple copies of the financial records and witness statements he had accumulated. The documents painted a picture of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government and business, implicating senators, judges, and corporate executives in a conspiracy that had generated billions in illegal profits over the course of decades. Emily studied the evidence with the analytical skills she had developed as a teacher and the investigative instincts she had never fully abandoned. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Not just money laundering, but election fraud, judicial corruption, and systematic elimination of witnesses. Michael hadn't just stumbled onto a criminal organization. He had uncovered a shadow government that operated parallel to legitimate institutions. The meeting was scheduled for 9 p.m. at an abandoned grain elevator outside a town called Cedar Falls. Torres would bring 2 trusted agents, while Sarah would provide overwatch from a concealed position. Michael and Emily would approach the meeting site in Sarah's truck, taking a route designed to reveal any surveillance or ambush attempts. As evening approached, Emily felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment. 5 days ago, she had been a small-town teacher whose biggest concern was choosing curriculum for her English classes. Now she was preparing to meet with federal agents while armed criminals searched the countryside for her. The transformation should have been impossible, but somehow it felt like the logical progression of choices she had made freely. Michael seemed to sense her thoughts as they prepared to leave the ranch. He apologized once again for the chaos he had brought into her life, but Emily stopped him with a gesture. She had been thinking about that night at the bus stop, about the moment she had decided to get into his car. Every choice since then had been hers to make, and she didn't regret any of them. The drive to Cedar Falls took 40 minutes along back roads that Sarah knew intimately. She maintained radio contact with them from her position in the hills above the meeting site, providing updates on vehicle movements and potential threats. The grain elevator loomed against the darkening sky like a monument to agricultural ambitions that had died with the family farms of previous generations. Torres was already waiting when they arrived, a compact man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of alert stillness that marked experienced law enforcement officers. His 2 companions positioned themselves to cover the approaches while he approached Michael and Emily directly. His first words were an apology for the circumstances that had brought them together, followed by assurance that his team had swept the area for threats and established a secure perimeter. Michael presented his evidence methodically, explaining how each document connected to the larger pattern of corruption. Torres listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification or additional detail. His questions demonstrated familiarity with the people and organizations Michael had identified, suggesting that federal law enforcement had been tracking some of these activities independently. The meeting had been in progress for 20 minutes when Sarah's voice crackled through their earpieces with an urgent warning. Multiple vehicles were approaching from different directions, moving with coordination that indicated tactical training. The secure perimeter Torres had established was about to be breached by what appeared to be a significant force. Torres immediately began issuing orders to his team, but even as he spoke, Emily could see headlights converging on their position from multiple directions. The abandoned grain elevator suddenly felt like a trap rather than a meeting site, and she wondered if they had been betrayed again, despite all their precautions. Michael grabbed the evidence files and started moving toward their truck, but Torres stopped him with a sharp command. Running would only confirm their guilt to whoever was approaching, and Sarah's overwatch position gave them tactical advantages they would lose by fleeing. Torres made a command decision that surprised everyone. Instead of attempting escape, he called for immediate federal backup and prepared to defend their position. The next few minutes unfolded with the surreal clarity that emergency situations sometimes provide. Armed men emerged from vehicles that had surrounded the grain elevator, but they weren't wearing federal identification or following law enforcement protocols. Their equipment and movements suggested private military contractors, the kind of people who worked for organizations wealthy enough to field their own armies. Torres identified himself as a federal agent and demanded that the approaching force stand down. but his commands were ignored. Sarah's voice in their earpieces provided tactical updates, while she engaged targets from her concealed position, her rifle fire disrupting the coordinated approach of their attackers. Emily found herself crouched behind concrete barriers that had once supported grain storage equipment, listening to automatic weapons fire and wondering how her life had reached this point. Michael was beside her, clutching the evidence that represented their only hope of ending the nightmare permanently. Torres and his agents had taken defensive positions and were returning fire with the disciplined precision of experienced officers. The battle, because that's what it had become, lasted less than 10 minutes, but felt like hours. Sarah's intervention from the hills had broken up the initial assault, while Torres's radio calls had summoned additional federal agents who arrived with the overwhelming force that only government resources could provide. The private army that had seemed so formidable melted away when faced with legitimate federal response, leaving behind abandoned vehicles and equipment that would provide valuable intelligence. In the aftermath, as federal agents secured the scene and paramedics treated minor injuries, Torres finally had the opportunity to explain why he had been willing to risk everything for a meeting with fugitives. The FBI had been building a case against the same organization that had been hunting Michael, but they lacked the financial evidence necessary to secure convictions. Michael's documentation provided the missing pieces of a puzzle that had frustrated federal investigators for years. Emily listened to Torres outline the protection and legal immunity Michael would receive in exchange for his testimony, but she found her attention drawn to a more immediate concern. The people who had sent private armies to kill them tonight wouldn't be deterred by legal proceedings or federal protection. They had too much to lose and too many resources to simply accept defeat. Michael seemed to share her concerns because his first question to Torres was whether the FBI could guarantee their safety until the trials concluded. Torres's honest answer was that they could provide better protection than running and hiding, but that complete safety was impossible against adversaries with unlimited resources and no respect for law. Emily realized that her old life wasn't just over. It had been obliterated so completely that going back was impossible even if the immediate threat disappeared. But as she watched Michael finally hand over the evidence he had protected at such terrible cost, she felt something unexpected. Relief. They had reached the end of running, and whatever happened next, they would face it together with the full power of the federal government behind them. The storm clouds that had been building all day finally opened, sending rain cascading over the abandoned grain elevator and washing away the last traces of the battle that had just concluded. Emily found the symbolism almost too obvious, but she couldn't deny the sense of cleansing that came with the downpour. The rain that had brought her and Michael together was now washing away the old world and preparing ground for whatever would grow in its place. Torres was explaining the witness protection program when Michael's phone rang. The ringtone was different from before, sharp, urgent. Michael looked at the caller ID and his face went white. He showed the screen to Torres, who immediately gestured for silence from his team. "Katya," Michael whispered, answering in what Emily now recognized as Russian. The conversation was brief, tense, punctuated by long pauses that seemed to stretch forever. When he hung up, Michael looked like he had aged 10 years in as many minutes. His sister was missing. The Portland apartment Torres's people were supposed to be watching was empty, signs of a struggle evident. A single message had been left on the kitchen table. "You have until sunrise. Come alone or she dies." The address was for a warehouse district in Baltimore, a 5-hour drive in good weather. Torres immediately began coordinating resources, calling in tactical teams and surveillance units. But Michael was already shaking his head, explaining that these people had survived decades by being smarter than law enforcement. Any official presence would result in Katya's immediate execution. The message was clear. This was personal, and it would end the way it had begun, with Michael facing his past alone. Emily watched the argument unfold between Michael and Torres, feeling the terrible weight of inevitability settling over them. The federal protection that had seemed like salvation minutes ago now felt like a cage. Michael's tormentors had outmaneuvered them again, using the one person he couldn't abandon to force him back into their reach. "I have to go," Michael said finally, his voice carrying a finality that made Emily's chest tighten. "This ends tonight, one way or another." Torres protested that it was suicide, that they needed time to plan, to coordinate, But Emily could see in Michael's eyes that time was the one thing they didn't have. Every minute they delayed was another minute Katya spent in the hands of people who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill. "Then I'm going with you," Emily said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Both men turned to stare at her. Michael's expression was a mixture of gratitude and horror. "Emily, no. This isn't your fight." "It became my fight the moment I got in your car," she replied. "These people know who I am. They've threatened me. If you disappear tonight, what do you think happens to me? I spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for them to decide I'm a loose end." The logic was irrefutable, but Michael continued to protest. Emily cut him off with a gesture that reminded her of her classroom authority. She had made her decision based on the same calculus she had been using all week. The safe choice was an illusion, and the dangerous choice was the only one that offered any hope of a future. Torres proposed a compromise that satisfied no one but represented their best option. A small surveillance team would follow at a distance, ready to provide support if the situation escalated beyond Michael's ability to handle it. Emily and Michael would approach the warehouse together, giving the impression of compliance while maintaining options for escape or resistance. The drive to Baltimore passed intense silence, broken only by Torres's periodic radio updates. The warehouse district was exactly what Emily had expected. Abandoned industrial buildings surrounded by empty lots and broken streetlights. The address they had been given led to a sprawling complex that had once manufactured aircraft parts, but now served as shelter for the homeless and staging ground for criminal enterprises. They found the specific building without difficulty, a 5-story structure with most of its windows boarded over, surrounded by a fence that had been cut in multiple places. Light showed through windows on the 3rd floor, and Emily could make out shadows moving behind improvised curtains. Michael's hand found hers as they approached the building, his fingers cold despite the mild evening temperature. The main entrance had been left unlocked, as if their hosts were confident in their ability to control the situation regardless of how their guests arrived. Michael and Emily climbed stairs that creaked ominously under their weight, guided by the sound of voices from above. The building smelled of rust and abandonment, decades of decay concentrated into an atmosphere that made every breath feel contaminated. The 3rd floor had been converted into a makeshift command center, complete with electronic equipment, maps, and enough weapons to outfit a small army. The silver-haired man from the hotel stood in the center of it all, no longer bothering with the pretense of civility. Katya Kozlov sat in a chair near the windows, her hands bound but her eyes defiant. She looked like a female version of Michael. Same dark hair, same intelligent eyes, same stubborn set to her jaw. "Welcome to the end of the story," the silver-haired man said without preamble. "You have caused us considerable inconvenience, Michael. It's time to settle accounts." Michael asked about the terms. The answer was simple and brutal. Michael would return to Miami and resume his work for the organization, this time without the luxury of ignorance about their true business. In exchange, Katya would be released, and Emily would be allowed to disappear back into her small-town existence. Refusal would result in both women dying while Michael watched, followed by his own execution. Emily felt the trap closing around them with mechanical precision. These people had planned for every contingency, controlled every variable. Michael's evidence was already in federal hands, but that wouldn't save the people he cared about if he refused to cooperate. The silver-haired man made it clear that the organization had survived government investigations before by eliminating witnesses and corrupting officials. They could do it again. But as Emily listened to the ultimatum being delivered, she noticed something the silver-haired man had missed. Katya's bonds weren't as secure as they appeared. She had been working at the ropes around her wrists with patient persistence. More importantly, the electronic equipment scattered around the room included communication devices that were currently active, transmitting everything being said to unknown recipients. Emily caught Katya's eye and saw understanding pass between them. Whatever was about to happen, Michael's sister was ready to act. Emily began positioning herself closer to the weapons cache, moving with the casual slowness of someone who had accepted defeat. The silver-haired man was explaining the logistics of Michael's return to servitude when the building's lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in seconds later, but those seconds were enough. Katya had freed herself and was moving toward the weapons, while Emily tackled the nearest guard. Michael, finally understanding that surrender had never been an option, threw himself at the silver-haired man with the fury of someone who had nothing left to lose. The fight that followed was brutal and chaotic, made more dangerous by the dim lighting and unfamiliar terrain. Emily discovered that her years of dealing with unruly teenagers had given her a surprising capacity for violence when properly motivated. She found herself wielding a communications device as an improvised weapon, bringing it down on the head of a man twice her size with enough force to drop him permanently. Katya had reached the weapons cache and was distributing firepower with the efficiency of someone who knew her way around combat situations. Michael was locked in deadly struggle with the silver-haired man, both of them fighting with the desperation of people who understood that only one would leave the building alive. The turning point came when Torres's backup team finally arrived, following the sounds of gunfire to their location. Federal agents swarmed the building with overwhelming force, but the real victory had already been decided. The silver-haired man lay motionless on the concrete floor, Michael standing over him with blood on his hands and something like peace in his eyes. In the aftermath, as paramedics treated injuries and federal agents processed evidence, Emily found herself standing at the broken windows, looking out at the Baltimore skyline. The rain had followed them from the grain elevator, turning the city streets into rivers of reflected neon. She felt Michael approach before he spoke, his presence as familiar now as her own heartbeat. He thanked her for saving his life, for saving Katya's life, for being brave enough to follow him into hell. Emily's response surprised them both. She told him she hadn't been brave. She had been terrified every step of the way. But sometimes being terrified was better than being bored, and she had learned that safety was an illusion anyway. Katya joined them at the windows, wrapping her arms around her brother with the fierce affection of family members who had thought they might never see each other again. She studied Emily with frank curiosity, clearly trying to understand what kind of woman would voluntarily involve herself in their nightmare. When she finally spoke, it was to thank Emily for taking care of Michael when she couldn't. Emily's response was simple and honest. She had fallen in love with him, not with the mysterious stranger who had rescued her from the rain, but with the man who had chosen to trust her with the truth, who had fought to protect people he barely knew, who had been willing to sacrifice himself for his sister's safety. The admission felt like another kind of surrender, but this time to something hopeful rather than destructive. Dawn was breaking over Baltimore's harbor when they finally left the warehouse district. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets washed clean and gleaming in the early light. Torres had arranged temporary housing while the federal prosecutors prepared their case, but the immediate threat was over. The organization that had hunted Michael for 8 months was in ruins, its leadership dead or in custody, its financial networks exposed and frozen. Emily rode in the back seat of the federal sedan, watching the city wake up around them. She thought about her classroom in Millbrook, about the lesson plans she would never complete, and the students she would never see graduate. That life felt like something that had happened to someone else, a story she had read rather than lived. Michael sat beside her, holding her hand with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to take such simple intimacy for granted. They hadn't talked about what came next, about whether the future included a shared address or separate paths that occasionally crossed. But Emily found she wasn't worried about those details. For the first time in her life, uncertainty felt like possibility rather than threat. Katya had already made plans to disappear into the Federal Witness Protection Program, at least temporarily. She had her own life to rebuild, her own decisions to make about what identity to assume and where to start over. But she had made Emily promise to take care of Michael, and Emily had given that promise gladly. The safe house Torres had arranged was a modest apartment in a building that could have been in any American city. Generic furniture, neutral colors, the kind of place that was designed to be temporarily comfortable rather than permanently memorable. Emily stood at the kitchen window, looking out at a view that included a bus stop across the street, and started laughing. Michael asked what was funny. Emily explained that she was thinking about that rainy evening in Millbrook, about how she had been waiting for the 4:47 bus that never came. If the bus had been on time, if the rain had held off for another hour, if she had been brave enough to call a taxi or walk home, none of this would have happened. She would still be grading papers and planning lessons and living the small, safe life she had built to protect herself from chaos. Michael pointed out that she might also still be alive if she had caught that bus. Emily's response was immediate and certain. She might have been alive, but she wouldn't have been living. The difference, she had learned, was significant. They spent the morning in domestic activities that felt surreal after the violence of the previous week, making coffee, sharing a newspaper, discussing what kind of groceries they needed. Normal couple activities, except that they weren't a normal couple, and their future remained entirely uncertain. The conversation about what came next began naturally, without the weight of formal decision-making. Michael would have to testify in multiple trials, a process that could take years. Emily would need a new identity, a new profession, a new everything. The federal government could provide those things, but they came with restrictions and limitations that made ordinary life complicated. Emily suggested they take it one day at a time, a philosophy that would have terrified her a week ago, but now seemed like the only sensible approach to an unpredictable world. Michael agreed, adding that he had learned to find hope in small things: morning coffee, shared laughter, the sound of rain that no longer meant running for shelter. As afternoon approached, Emily found herself standing at the window again, watching people board the bus across the street. Regular people living regular lives, following predictable schedules to familiar destinations. She felt a momentary pang of loss for the simplicity she had abandoned, but it passed quickly. Michael joined her at the window, following her gaze to the bus stop. He asked if she regretted missing that bus in Millbrook, if she wished she could go back to her old life. Emily considered the question seriously before answering. She told him about a conversation she'd had with her students about The Great Gatsby, about Fitzgerald's famous line about being born back ceaselessly into the past. She had always taught that as a warning about the dangers of nostalgia, but now she understood it differently. The past wasn't something you were born back into. It was something you chose to carry with you or leave behind. Emily had chosen to leave behind the woman who had waited for buses and planned lessons and lived according to schedules set by other people. That woman had served her purpose, had kept her safe through the years when safety was what she needed most. But she had outgrown that life, had discovered capacities for courage and love that couldn't flourish in the greenhouse of routine she had built. The rain started again as evening approached, drops hitting the window in patterns that reminded Emily of that first night at the Millbrook Inn. But this time, the rain didn't represent disruption or chaos. It was just weather, natural and temporary, something that would pass and leave the world refreshed in its wake. Michael asked what she wanted for dinner, a question so beautifully ordinary that it made Emily smile. She suggested they figure it out together the same way they would figure out everything else, one decision at a time with honesty and trust, and the kind of love that grew stronger under pressure rather than breaking apart. Outside their window, the bus pulled away from the stop, carrying its passengers toward destinations that had been determined before they boarded. Emily watched it disappear into traffic, carrying with it the last remnants of her old life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to choose courage over comfort. But tonight, they had survived. Tonight, they had each other. And tonight, as rain drummed against the windows of their temporary home, Emily Chen and Michael Kozlov began the careful work of building something permanent from the wreckage of everything they had lost. The morning left a trace of yesterday's words in the air, as if they continued to sound despite the silence. There was a rush in his step, but also something of a promise that could not be spoken. She stood by the window until the bus disappeared around the corner, and she knew that there would be an incompleteness between them. Not a break, but a thread, thin and alive. The room slowly filled with the pale light of dawn, dissolving the shadows that had clung to every corner during the night. Objects that only hours ago seemed fragile and uncertain suddenly regained their ordinary outlines. The chair by the wall, the folded blanket, the books left on the table. Yet none of it was truly the same because every detail now carried the invisible weight of what had happened. Even the silence itself was no longer neutral. It carried warmth, memory, and a quiet ache. She tried to return to the rhythm of morning as she always knew it. The kettle boiled, steam rose from the cup, and the ordinary routine traced its familiar path. But every gesture seemed slightly delayed, like the echo of a song whose melody lingered long after the music had stopped. She felt as though the space around her had become both too small and endlessly vast. confining her body yet stretching her thoughts far beyond the horizon. Outside, the rain continued, slow and deliberate, painting long, trembling lines on the glass. The sound was steady, like a patient metronome, reminding her of time passing, of movement beyond her reach. She watched drops collect, merge, and slide down, as if each one carried a fragment of her own uncertainty. The world beyond the window blurred, softened, until only the shape of the school bus approaching stood out in sharp relief. The bus halted with its usual groan, doors opening to the same daily rhythm. Children climbed aboard, carrying backpacks, laughter, and the ordinary concerns of their small worlds. She observed them with a strange distance, as if she belonged both to that familiar routine and to something entirely apart from it. The sight stirred something fragile within her, the recognition that life continued, steady and unyielding, even as her own inner world had shifted beyond repair. She understood, in that quiet instant, that nothing truly ended. His departure had not closed the story, but left it suspended, as if the thread connecting them stretched invisibly through the air, too fine for the eye but strong enough to resist the weight of absence. It was a promise written not in words but in silence, in the subtle changes etched into her. As the bus pulled away, its engine humming low, she remained at the window, tracing the condensation with the tip of her finger. The outline she drew dissolved almost immediately, erased by the damp breath of morning, but she did not mind. The act itself mattered more than the result, the gesture of acknowledging the moment, of grounding herself in the fleeting intersection of memory and presence. Her life would resume. The lessons to prepare, the faces of students waiting, the routines of a teacher's day would claim her hours. But underneath it all, there would remain this hidden layer, a quiet knowledge she could not unlearn. It was not dramatic, not tragic, not even fully joyful, simply the realization that chance could enter at any moment, altering the texture of everything. The bus disappeared down the street, swallowed by the curtain of rain. She let her hand rest against the cool glass, listening to the soft rhythm outside, feeling both the loss and the strange, fragile hope that came with it. And in that delicate balance, between what was gone and what might still return, she found herself breathing a little differently, as if the air itself had changed, not a break, but a thread, thin, alive, and unbroken.